toxic polarization, the way we demonize each other across differences, is causing breakdown, as we all experience, from the dinner table to family vacation, from the workplace to worship services. 66% of Americans say that when discussing issues with those with whom they disagree, people are quick to attack them. I'm sure none of us have experienced that. 62% say the political climate prevents them from even saying what they believe. You know, Abraham Lincoln, quoting Jesus, said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. They weren't playing. Yet more than half of us now say our fellow Americans pose the biggest threat to the country. Nearly all of us, 87%, recognize this threat, and 71% rightly conclude that our democracy itself is in danger. Even more troubling, 61% say they're concerned that the U.S. could be on the verge of another civil war, as 35% of partisans now believe violence could be justified to advance their party's goals. Americans across party lines and demographic groups are recognizing that, quote, division in the country is the most important issue facing them personally, and they rank uniting the country as the most important national priority. So we all have an urgent choice to make. We're going to fight against fellow Americans, or are we going to fight for America? Personally, I'm with the 79% of Americans who believe creating more opportunities like today's peace talks for people to talk with those who have different values and views would be effective in reducing divisiveness. What's interesting is when assured that they would actually be listened to respectfully, imagine that, more than 4 times as many Americans, 61%, are interested in having the kind of opportunities we're having right here today. Indeed, this listening with curiosity, I think, is the key to successful conversation across differences. Thus, the name, mantra, and common hashtag of the Bridging Movement's Listen First Coalition, of now 400 plus organizations bringing Americans together across differences, including Peace Direct as a real beacon for the field. You know, seeing an escalating crisis of toxic polarization and believing the best way to turn the tide is by working together, 4 of our bridging organizations created this coalition in 2017. Then in this movement that you all are leading into the work of coalition partners such as Peace Direct. I'm given hope by the fact that 3/4 of Americans believe it is still possible for the U.S. to fulfill and achieve its ideal and national motto, E pluribus unum, for many people, one. 79% say that given the opportunity, they would play a part in reducing social division in America. So how about us? Will you show up for each other and for the country we love? It starts with bringing your voice to the conversation. And thank you so much for taking that big first step today.
Thank you, Pierce, for those moving, stirring words. As you heard him say, listening with curiosity is key to bridging divides. That really resonates with me, listening with curiosity. And now more than ever, it's crucial for conflict to be transformed, that we listen to those who are closest to it. That's where Peace Direct comes in. That's the work that we do. We support peace builders, keeping power in their hands, people close to the communities where conflict needs to be transformed. Peace needs to be built. We don't want to turn a blind eye to our neighbors' humanity, to our neighbors' suffering. So if this is speaking to you and you are so moved, we invite you to make a donation. If you're joining us on Zoom, the link to donate is in the chat box. And if you're tuning in on YouTube, the link is in the top right corner of your screen. We thank you very much for any support that you would give towards Peace Builders. Now, I'd like to take the time to introduce our esteemed panelists. We're very, very grateful today to have 3 women joining us from different corners of the peace building environment, each making it their life's work to uplift peace on our planet. First, I'd like to introduce Ms. Binalakshmi Nepram. Bina, as she's more commonly known, was born in the state of Manipur, located in India's northeast region. She's a writer, humanitarian, and civil rights activist, spearheading work on making women-led peace security, and disarmament, a movement, an issue that is meaningful to people's lives. In 2004, Ms. Nepram co-founded India's first civil society organization, which is working on conventional disarmament issues, namely the Control Arms Foundation of India. And in 2007, in order to help thousands of women who are affected by gun violence in her home state of Manipur, Ms. Nepram launched the Manipur Women Gun Survivor Network. Bina, welcome to our panel. Now I'd like to introduce Ms. Alexandra Stark. Alex is a senior researcher for the Political Reform Program. She has a PhD from the government department at Georgetown University. She was previously a research fellow at the Middle East Initiative of the Harvard Kennedy School's Balfour Center for Science and International Affairs, and Minerva Jennings Randolph Peace Scholar at the United States Institute of Peace. Stark has written for Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, War on the Rocks, and other publications. And her academic research has been published in the journals International Security and Security Studies. Thank you and welcome, Alex. Amanda Van Dort currently serves in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues within State Department, mandated to promote the rights and empowerment of women and girls through U.S. foreign policy. From 2018 to 2021, Amanda was the Senior Advisor on Women, Peace, and Security Policy Team in the United States Department of State, Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, CSO. Previously, Amanda served as the country director for Emerge Global, a nonprofit based in Sri Lanka that supports teenage girls who are survivors of sexual assault and abuse. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you to the three of you. So glad to have you here today. And I will just jump right in, as I know that we will have a very rich conversation. Can you speak a little bit to what led to your work in peace building and also in reimagining the world centered around equality and equity? What led to your work in this area? Please feel free to unmute. How did you come to be involved in peace building?
I can start, I guess. I wanted to see if others wanted to. First, just want to say thank you so much to Peace Direct for hosting this important conversation, inviting the U.S. government to participate, and really excited to hear the audience's questions and to have this discussion. I can say from my own experience, my kind of interest or awareness of equity issues began kind of right after undergrad. I worked for an initiative called Project Healthy Schools in Detroit, Michigan, working specifically with low-income middle school students that were either at risk of or already pre-diabetic or diabetic as a result of a lack of funding for exercise in school, as well as healthy food. And so, that initiative really was trying to provide education. We had a community garden. We taught, one class a day on, how to eat healthy, how to take care of yourself, instituted gym classes, everything else, cooking classes for parents. But really, at the end of the day, it was kind of emblematic of the way that, even the international donor community treats issues in other countries, where we're coming in with our own ideas and kind of addressing symptoms, but not realizing that there are much broader systemic issues that need to be addressed for this to be sustainable. So, teaching cooking classes is all good and fine, but if we're not aware of the fact that there isn't access to fresh food or grocery stores nearby, or, mothers that are, single moms working 3 jobs that, are going to get McDonald's on the way home, right? And so not really addressing that, I could see that there was, that equity is really important. And then for Emerge Global in Sri Lanka, I think that's really where the peace building and that was post-conflict at the time in 2011 is when I first got there, really realizing that there is a significant societal impact to women and girls not having bodily autonomy, and not really realizing that, something that is so individual as, a teenage girl that has a child as a result of rape or incest, seeing that the implications of that are much, much broader than just that girl or her family or that community. And so that's kind of where my interest kind of and what led me to this type of work.
Yeah, I can jump in. My apologies. Really, thank you, Peace Direct, for inviting all of us. And our work for peace building started because for many of us who were born in war and conflict zones, that becomes like a default. So it's the amount of violence one sees at the societal level in Manipur, in northeast of India, which is bordering Burma, where 20,000 have been killed in the last years of this conflict, which is happening in this part of India, which is hidden away from the rest of the world. And the lack of humanitarian support to this part of the world made me set up a network called Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network in the year 2007, which led me to committing my life for peace. So this is how, for any child growing up in a conflict zone, you don't realize that the bomb blast, the bombing operations, the gunshots that you hear, we all thought those were normal ways of like growing up till you come out from this war zone and you realize you actually grew up in abnormal situations. So it's just for us, for many of us, and thousands of Manipuris and people in northeast of India, where we are from, which I don't know if any one of you listening here is aware, we have a martial law in that part of the world for the last 64 years. But the news from this part of the world is hidden away by the government from international eyes. So for us, when there are no international humanitarian organizations coming in, when no press is allowed to report on this conflict, it becomes a part of this world's forgotten crisis. If we have more than 20 known conflicts in the world, ranging from Myanmar to Sudan to Afghanistan to Rwanda, but there are 300 plus unreported conflicts in the world, and the Manipur conflict that I come from is one of them. So that's how, in short, we started the peace work in our part of the world.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Thanks so much to Peace Direct for organizing this great event and for all of the wonderful work that you do. I was just looking over the Race and Peace Building report that you recently put out right before this, and it's just full of really fascinating insights. And I'm really honored to be, in conversation with such amazing and inspiring folks. So thank you for that. So for me, my mom's family is Armenian and my dad's family is Jewish from Eastern Europe. And this is a particularly poignant kind of a week or couple of weeks because it's Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day and also Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I grew up hearing stories of how my great-grandparents on both sides of my family came to the US as refugees fleeing violence and persecution and genocide in their home countries. So although I didn't live those experiences firsthand, that part of my identity, those stories in my family, gave me a really keen sense of the devastation that political violence creates for ordinary folks and the importance of preventing such violence. The other piece for me is that I'm a Quaker, so peace has long been kind of a central value for me. And although I research and work on national security issues, I've always tried to see security policy primarily as potentially a tool for peace, or as a tool that can be used against peace when it's in the wrong hands. But spending time in Quaker communities has shown me that peace really is possible. There is another way, and that the kind of national security perspective isn't the only way, or even the most realistic way necessarily to look at the world.
Thank you for sharing these three very different stories of how you each came to this work, and how poignant. It really reminds me that we each have the potential to be peace builders. And we each have the potential to be change makers in our environment. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to ask a question that really gets at the heart of peace building itself. So my question is, why is it important to listen to local peace builders? Of course, we are here at the behest and hosting of Local First National Week of Conversation. And as we heard Pierce say, listening to people who are in the communities where conflict is happening is key. And I wanted to get each of your take on why you believe that to be so, and how we can actually amplify the voices of local peace builders.
I can take that question, Elana. The question I would like to pose back is, are the policymakers really listening to people on the ground? My 15 years of work experience showed that it isn't working. We have, from Manipur, we came to New Delhi, established the Office of the Control Arms Foundation of India. We reached out to members of parliament, we reached out to government, Prime Minister's office, even to the United Nations. In today's world, governments and policymakers, and including the United Nations, they are not listening to people on the ground. And I would like to share through this platform that, and we know why it is, nation states are built on war making. It's unfortunate, but this cannot be the world for tomorrow. And we, the communities who have lived in more than 7 decades of conflict, intergenerational conflict that I've seen in my own family, in our own communities. So we have to redefine peace. Right now, yesterday, CIPRI came out that the world is spending $2 trillion on the armament industry. And just last year, 2 years ago, people didn't have oxygen. People died. Millions died in the pandemic. So we are at this reckoning moment in the global history that we have to turn it around. And it is communities on the ground, peace builders, and indigenous communities who have seen it for themselves, what violence have done, years of colonization, racialized politics have done to us. So I think right now, no one is listening to us. We tried for 10 years in India, the world's largest democracy. They only listen to corporates. They listen to people with money, people with power. They listen to oil magnates, money people, but they're not listening to people like you and me. So I think we just have to, and in this global month of listening, my appeal is we have to do our politics, our peace politics in a way. Right now, it isn't working. We are not being listened to. If not, many of the policies, whether it's in India, United States, or what's happening in Ukraine, people have been asking for freedom, for peace, but are they listening to us? So we are at that critical moment, and we need to really put our heads together so that we are finally, the voices of the people are finally listened to.
For me, I think about this from a few perspectives. So One is that there's an ethical component, which is that so often in US foreign policy making, especially from this kind of national security perspective, we neglect to ask the people in the countries that we're actually talking about, the communities that we're talking about, what their aspirations are, what they need, what they want to see the United States and the international community do. I think that's a real moral failing on our part. The fact that, as Bina said, we're not listening, that's a real moral failing. And if we want to live our values in the world, those values of democracy, of self-determination, of every voice having a say and a vote, then we need to at least be willing to listen to what people have to say, and not just the political elites of other countries, but the people like Bina who are actually doing the work on the ground in their communities. But there's another version that's more kind of instrumental. This is the argument that I like to make to the national security audiences. And that is that working with and lifting up local peace builders is actually also good for US national security. So if we want to contribute to stability, if we want to eliminate terrorism and political violence, then we know from research, from experience, that engaging with local peace builders and community leaders is really the most effective and most sustainable way to do that. And we also know that many of the methods that we've kind of pursued up until now, things like partnering with authoritarian regimes or conducting military counterterrorism operations, those haven't really been all of that sustainable or effective. So why not actually try what we know actually works and really listen to and work with local peace builders?
Yeah, I would agree 100% with both of the panelists' responses here. I mean, really, this is the underlying and the entire premise of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is that, populations have a right, an inherent opinion on and a right to participate in decision making that affects them and their communities. And so, I do, within the US government, we have to do our own advocacy as gender advisors. I try to reiterate the effectiveness part of what Alexandra mentioned, but really that there's a reason that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda was, formalized. I won't say started because it's been going on for a long time, but formalized in the UN Security Council. And not the UN General Assembly, not the Human Rights Council, right? It's showing that that this is a security issue, and there are security implications for failing to include women in decision making. And that includes about efforts to prevent and resolve conflict. Alexandra also mentioned counterterrorism. And I will say, one other thing on the effectiveness, because, sometimes the kind of general studies and the framing of women, peace, and security as a kind of women's issue or a human rights issue isn't as effective. One of the things that, has been helpful internally is that, to basically reiterate or emphasize the fact that the importance of understanding not just local dynamics, but really the power dynamics, the power structures, and the gender norms and the expectations around behavior. And that really, when we're doing any sort of actor analysis and trying to figure out, the motivation, I mean, really, your interventions are trying to impact the motivations of actors towards violence, perpetrating violence, or inciting violence, right? And there's no way to address that without recognizing that gender norms are really driving everything, whether it is, fulfilling the expected gender norms or, basically acting in a way that is completely opposite, right? These conceptions around masculinity and femininity and what are the roles of men and women? How do you prove your manness or womanhoodness, right? And so I think that has been a helpful internal advocacy point, that not just desk studies, not just national level data is not going to get you the nuanced information that you need about power structures and dynamics at a local level for any interventions to be effective or sustainable. So definitely agree with the points that, for listening to local communities and doing that deliberate outreach, there's an ethical side and there's an effectiveness side, but the security implications are real. And that's why this is a UN Security Council mandate.
I will just highlight something and then turn it over to you, Bina, because actually my next question is something I think your work is very poised to answer well. So I appreciate some of these comments coming forth about unequal power dynamics, about whose experience gets to matter, which narratives get to be the ones that claim the day and set the tempo, set the strategies. So my question is about Indigenous voices. How can the story of Indigenous people, Indigenous women in the peace movement help define the future of peace building? And a follow-up question about diversity in narratives. Why is it important to include diversity in narratives and tell genuine history? And how does that impact peace building? Bina?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I wanted to respond to Amanda's Women, Peace and Security because we've been working on it for the last 10 years. But most important, I wanted to just recenter your question, Elana, and actually the future is actually Indigenous. The future is Indigenous, and more particularly the future is Indigenous women who will, if there is the need for a peace which is able to be strong and to be able to define the next 100 years of our lives, it is the work that the Indigenous women are doing, which needs to be put in the forefront of the world to be able to claim that peace which every one of us in this earth desperately needs. So I think I just wanted to share this, and this is shared after I'm sharing after more than a decade of work, working with women all across the Indo-Burma border, and now with women across 7 sociocultural Indigenous zones of the world.
Bina, let me dig a little more. When you say that, so just thinking about our audience, some people may automatically know what you mean. Maybe they are part of an Indigenous community, but
Sure.
For those who don't,
yes,
why should we understand this? Why should we take the time to and who are you speaking of really?
Absolutely, yeah. This will require a whole 1-hour lecture or sharing, but in a second or a minute, I would like to share that what happened is, if you look at 500 years of colonization, Indigenous communities in all around the world, there are 476 million Indigenous people living in 93 countries and territories around the world today. Now, because of colonization, look at what happened in the United States, what happened in India. If you look at this, Indigenous population have been absolutely relegated to the literally the footholds of history. And then layers of the fiction of the world have been created by denying them their rights, they're denying them their history, their narratives. Now, the thing is, 500 years of repression and colonization did not succeed. In the United States, 9 million out of 10 million Indigenous people were killed to make what is known as United States of America. And in India, more than 45 million Indigenous people live in the area where I was born. The history of 45 million people, our narratives, are not in the textbooks of our country. So the complete deletion of millions of people in different parts of the world and their wisdom, their ways of connecting with nature, right from colonization to industrialization to what has come about, led to human beings' rupture with nature. And the way you look at Ukraine, buildings which are being built over decades could be destroyed by one missile. How it has really pulped communities and buildings in Ukraine right now. It shows in as much as we can destroy in seconds this world. So indigeneity becomes central to today's conversation to decolonize the world that we live in, which has been built on repression and on greed and on a kind of subduing of millions of people. And that's why indigeneity is coming back to the front, not because we want to harp back to the past, but the knowledge, the culture, the ways of coexistence, the kind of foreign policy done during indigenous. Look at the Great Law of Peace of the Haudenosaunee people, which is one of the important tools of how we coexist as communities. Our foreign policies are built on a foreign policy of war, but not on peace. So we have ministries of defense, but we don't have ministries of peace. Why not? So I think, as I mentioned, when I talk about indigeneity, as I mentioned, it's not about harping back to a past, but I'm now researching indigenous constitution, indigenous ways of world making, which includes not just about culture, but it's also about how do you conduct foreign affairs with another country, another region, another community, so that we don't hurt each other or invade one another. So that's why it's so important to have indigenous ways of world making in today's world, because it's going to help not just indigenous communities, but people across to be able to communicate, to continue to coexist and build a world of peace and not of war. War making has been defining nation states, modern nation states. And if you look at any books, textbooks of history, of politics, of sociology, indigenous people have been always relegated as savages. Look at Tocqueville, look at Marx, look at any other social thinker, political thinker, philosopher. So like millions of people's history and narratives, in particular indigenous communities, have been subsumed by colonial world making, which we are trying to say, if we want to bring about peace, then we have to look at how, for example, humans and nature and communities, we can develop together. So that worldview, indigenous worldview, is something, and as I mentioned, the Great Law of Peace. Look at the title of even this Great Law of Peace, which is of the Haudenosaunee, has a lot to teach us. When I learned about it, I was absolutely astounded by the wisdom of what was written millions, literally centuries ago, which no one, when I was in India, I never learned about it. So we need to get many of these stories and narratives of many forgotten people and nations into the world today to be able to claim peace. And just to add to the footnote of Amanda, we took United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 and translate into local indigenous languages, and we train indigenous women all across the Indo-Burma border, including women parliamentarians in Myanmar. This was before the coup happened. And we were really trying hard to ensure how can we get women into decision-making, social, economic, and political, because our democracies are democracies where 50% of our population are excluded. So how can we build and attain an equal nation or an equal United Nations when 50% of populations are excluded? So it's a very important piece of document, which we are taking it to our heart and are really trying to ensure that it's implementable, it's implemented on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that and for reminding us of the many reasons that it's important to listen to our Indigenous people, our people of color. It's the wisdom, ways of connecting with nature, especially as we look at how climate change is affecting our peace building efforts. So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to turn us towards a question that gets at the heart of what are the blockages and systemic barriers on the policy level that keep these narratives from penetrating, that keep us from not centering diversity and local peace builders, community leaders, the way we can. If you would speak to that.
I can jump in here. So I think that your question is twofold. So one, What are the kind of internal barriers when we're making decisions around policy? But then secondly, for the barriers to doing this locally informed work, is that correct? Both sides? Yeah, I'd say, on the US government side, and I'll just speak, not on behalf of the US government, my personal opinion, I think that the biggest issue and threat to this field and policy making is the extreme shifts. And I think that that's what, in the opening remarks was referenced, is that having, not having a consistent, at least a moderate view that is consistently held, as opposed to having these extreme policy shifts with administration changes. It really ultimately negatively impacts women on the ground. And, I think that family planning is a perfect example of, having that tends to be the political, sexual and reproductive health tends to be the political football of the day. But if you think about the impacts on women themselves for being, educated about, the importance of voluntary and informed family planning, and then having access to those services and advocating for the uptake of those services, and then to have those taken away and then have the exact opposite message, being shared. I think I think that inconsistency undermines the credibility, right, of the international community, and also for the United Nations as well. When we're not putting words on paper into action, if we're not demonstrating and leading by example, it's very difficult. And you can I think it's a very fair assessment from women peace builders. The many women peace builders that came to DC raised this as well. They said that the US negotiating teams were majority white men, and that's who we were sending as representatives, right? And then for the UN, to constant every Security Council resolution, even that's tangentially related to security, not to a conflict situation, is including WPS language and 1325 language. But then in practice, if the UN is, the kind of main player in the Yemeni peace process, or the main player that's convening and isn't deliberately including women, then what does that say for, our actual commitment to this issue and our expectation that partner nations and governments, also fulfill this? So I think, internally, I think it's the policy shifts and not having, just a moderate, at least that's the base, that then, we can make incremental changes from there, just having that moderate, consistent stance and just like an accepted across the board approach to gender equality, and that includes women, peace, and security. And then when it comes to like the challenge for, at least for the US government in the field, I think that the implications of what happened in Libya are still very, very much felt with the embassy. And so there is a risk-averse posture that the department has with our personnel, right, going beyond the embassy walls, and, which also, it's a catch-22 because of what happened there in Libya, and, wanting to protect the diplomats, but then also being closed off if you're in the country, like those are our eyes and ears on the ground, right? And so it's very problematic because the countries that we, need to be out there the most in are unstable and insecure, and there are security issues, but not having the ability to have our U.S. government eyes and ears on the ground actually travel out to these places, I think is an extreme barrier. But to kind of end on a high note, I do think that under COVID, the use of innovative virtual communication methods and platforms, that's something that we can take those lessons learned and those best practices and use that in the absence of being able to travel.
I think from the perspective of kind of the national security community and folks who research and work on national security, one of the main issues is actually that we haven't even really begun to acknowledge yet that it's not just about what Americans want or American security interests that matter. So often, in the national security policymaking space, we don't really, as we've been saying, think about or acknowledge the fact that people who live in the countries that we're talking about, that we're making policy about, have their own perspectives, but also they have their own knowledge and expertise on the situation. And we tend to kind of assume that an expert is, someone who has read about things in books or has a PhD or something like that. And there's nothing wrong with those things. But people on the ground who are living in these communities also have expertise. And what we tend to assume that kind of we know best and try to impose solutions rather than actually listening and asking people, what are they already doing, and how can we not only learn from them and their expertise, but also provide support for those peace building efforts in a way that's really constructive and sustainable.
Thank you. Bina, did you want to add anything?
Yes, thank you. In fact, Alex, you mentioned the word national security many times, and we in India try to understand the word national security. And for us, this is how we have understood. If a woman in the streets of Delhi or India are raped every 22 minutes, that we, the women and people of other gender, are not able to walk in the streets at night after 9 o'clock. And we are attacked, assaulted, and violated because of the fact that we are out after 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. Then what is national security when a government is not able to protect our streets, our public spaces, our homes? So for us, we really wanted to go to court to define what is national security. I mean, national security should not be only defined on the perceived threat from China or Pakistan or India, for instance. We have really tried to engage with Indian government to say national security where we have enough food for people, we have enough healthcare, education, where every citizen are able to feel that they are being taken care by the government, which I call our second set of parents. So when that is not done, then what happens to communities, Black, brown, minority communities, whose narrative is not in the political narrative of the making of a country, whether it's India, United States, or any other country. So that's one thing I really wanted to share in terms of we on the ground are trying to understand and engage our government in defining. And regarding foreign policy, I know Sweden government did what is called feminist foreign policy, and I know there are challenges within the world of feminism, but I also am aware and how important, if you look at the foreign policy, we need to make it people-centric, and I think the feminist foreign policy looks into it. And I think right now, United States, my appeal, and many audience who are here, is United States is the world's largest spender of military arms, like defense spender in the world. And we have peace activists, we have a thing called follow the money. Like if you have $100 and put $88 in armament industry, that the rest of $12 is going to spend in our health, our mental health, our physical health, on hospital beds, it's not going to work. So I think nations like United States and my own country, India, which is one of the largest importer of weapons in the world, we have to engage our governments and call upon the policymakers in our government to really look into the, bravely and say, is this sustainable for us, our nations, and our planet? So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll conclude with a question that we ask at each and every Peace Talks, which is, in the face of conflict, everything going on in the world right now, which seems we had the pandemic, now we're having war and conflict in Ukraine, but not to mention the conflict zones that have been there already. In the face of conflict, what continues to give you hope?
For me, it's really talking to peace builders and folks like Bina and Amanda, and learning from their expertise and their experience. That's what gives me hope. I think it's easy to kind of look around the world, and Americans will sometimes do this and just, you see all these different wars and conflict and violence and kind of throw up their hands and say, this is impossible to fix, or violence is inevitable somehow. What can we do about this? But when you go and talk to folks who are working every day for peace and for justice in their own communities, you can start to see the incredible gains that they're able to make and the changes that they're able to make on the ground. So that might not show up in the international news or a think tank report or something like that, but you can see by learning from folks and talking to folks that are making a difference in the lives of people and are really making peace possible. So that's what gives me hope.
Okay, Amanda, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Actually, Elana, what gives us hope is hope itself. I would say, if you allow me, it's hope itself. Without that, everything else will be lost. And every time, for many of us who grew up in really, can you imagine in Manipur, for every 20 Manipuris, we have one military person. It's so militarized. And not to speak of non-state armed groups which operate there. So for many of us working in conflict zones, we have the guns of the state and the guns of the non-state pointing at you. And can you imagine trying to work, in that particular situation? So having, fired up in those kind of places and survive the violence and continuing to survive the violence, what gives us hope is that war is not normal, and peace in our hearts, our homes, our families and communities and nation is normal. We have normalized violence. We have normalized disinformation. We have normalized racism. We have normalized hate in today's world. And because peace is what is innate to every child born on this earth, peace is what is innate to every human species, living and non-living. I think for us, the hope is the resistance and the resilience that we know on the ground that this is the path towards the present and the future. And those who are warmongering, basing their lives on the coloniality of power, they may have the power for now, they have the money for now, but that's not going to sustain them or this planet Earth. So I think that is what gives us hope. And I have seen incredible amount of work done by women and peace builders on the ground in Manipur and Indo-Burma border, who have never been to school in their lives, but their activism, their resilience, their resistance is something which is fired. I belong to Manipur, where we have more than 114 years of women's movement, indigenous women's movement. And when I see the kind of, without having nothing left in their world, but the fire and the strength at which they fight governments, they try to bring policymakers to reason, and they patrol the streets of Manipur at night with bamboo torches to protect their children from further harm and hurt in these conflict zones, is what has given us hope and peace. And this is what we will continue to do so in the years to come. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I think that the points I was going to make I definitely agree with both of the panelists, and I know we're kind of close to time, but yeah, I think that, what gives me hope and what is inspiring and kind of driving at least me, and I know my colleagues at State Department, to continue to do this work, is seeing that when push comes to shove, women are going to get out there and lead movements and push back when there are issues. I mean, we saw this in Sudan. It was the women that got everyone organized, that took to the streets. One female protester in Afghanistan, just 2 days after the government fell, said, "We have no choice but to be bold." I mean, she, that to me is the inspiring part of it, is that, there isn't the responsibility for peace is not, sometimes I think the international donors think that it's ours, and we're leading it and we're responsible, when really we need to get out of the way and support the women that are on the ground and really support their efforts, because they're at the forefront. They know the issues. They are working for peace every single day. And when push comes to shove, they're going to be the ones that, the future is female. They're going to get out and they're going to organize people, and they're going to, if we can just support them and listen to them, I really do think that that's where the future of this field is.
Thank you all for your great contributions. We've heard today the future is Indigenous. We've heard the future is female. Definitely, we know the future looks a little bit different than how it is now, and we're all working towards that. I thank each of you. And just a final message to our audience. If the messages today resonated with you, if something touched you and said, yes, I want to get behind this, if it disturbs you that we've normalized violence, and you want to support peace builders who are impacting this on the ground, please make a donation. You can donate in the chat here if you're on Zoom. You can also donate on the right upper hand corner of your screen if you're on YouTube. Again, thank you so much all for joining us today for Peace Talks, and we look forward to engaging on this further in the future. Take care.
Recording stopped.